The warm September air carried the scent of barbecue smoke and freshly cut grass through the sliding door of my parents' ranch house in Oakdale. Sunday dinner had stretched into evening, and the living room buzzed with the comfortable chaos of extended family. Cousins sprawled across the sectional sofa, my nephew Jake balanced on the armrest showing everyone his latest skateboard video, and my Aunt Patricia laughed so hard at my uncle's fishing story that she nearly choked on her sweet tea. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I should have felt at home. This was the house where I'd grown up, where my mother still kept my high school track trophies on the mantel next to faded family photos. The same kitchen where she'd helped me practice multiplication tables at the counter, the same backyard where my father had taught me to change a tire on his old Chevy. But tonight, something felt different. The conversation kept circling back to the same topic, like water finding a drain.my house. The 3-bedroom colonial I'd bought 6 months earlier on Maple Street, 20 minutes from downtown Portland. They'd been talking about it all evening, passing around photos on my mother's phone, marveling at the hardwood floors I'd refinished myself and the kitchen backsplash I'd installed during Memorial Day weekend. My father kept mentioning the property value, how much equity I'd built already, how smart I'd been to buy in that neighborhood before prices climbed even higher. Maureen always was the sensible one, my mother said, refilling glasses around the coffee table. Never spent money on nonsense like some people. Her eyes flicked toward the empty chair where my sister Bethany usually sat, the same chair that had been vacant for 3 Sunday dinners in a row. Nobody mentioned her absence directly, but it hung in the room like humidity before a storm.my. Cousin Derek raised his beer toward me from across the room. Here's to homeownership before 30. That's the American dream right there. The family echoed his sentiment, glasses clinking, voices overlapping in approval. I smiled and nodded, but something about the toast felt rehearsed, like they'd been building toward this moment all evening. The praise should have warmed me. I'd worked 3 jobs through college, saved every bonus from my accounting position at Morrison & Associates, skipped vacations and restaurant dinners for 5 years to scrape together the down payment. While my friends spent weekends at bars or music festivals, I'd been researching mortgage rates and touring open houses with a notebook full of calculations. The house wasn't just a purchase. It was proof that discipline could overcome the financial chaos I'd grown up watching, but as the conversation continued, I noticed the way my parents exchanged glances across the room. Quick, meaningful looks that spoke of conversations I hadn't been part of. My mother's smile seemed strained around the edges, and my father kept checking his watch as though waiting for something. The number hit the room like a stone dropping into still water. Jake stopped fidgeting. Derek looked up from his phone. Even the little kids playing in the corner seemed to sense the gravity settling over the adults. She borrowed from loan sharks, my father continued, his voice heavy with the weight of having to explain his daughter's mistakes to his other daughter. Started with gambling debts, then she borrowed to pay those off, then borrowed more to cover the interest. It spiraled. He rubbed his face with both hands. These people don't care about payment schedules or hardship cases. They want their money, and they want it now. My mother reached across the space between us, her hand landing on my knee. We've already given her everything we have. Cleaned out our savings, borrowed against the house. But it's not enough. Her voice cracked slightly. If she doesn't pay them back by the end of next month, they're going to hurt her. Maybe worse. The room had gone completely silent now. No one pretended to be distracted anymore. All eyes were on me, waiting for my response to a question no one had asked yet. But I could feel it coming, building like pressure behind a dam. I stared at him, then at my mother, then at the family members who'd gone from celebrating my success to calculating how to redistribute it. The hardwood floors I'd sanded and stained myself, the mortgage payments I'd never missed, the years of sacrifice that had led to that set of keys on Maple Street, all of it suddenly seemed negotiable to them. Liquid assets in the face of Bethany's latest catastrophe. She's family, my mother added, her voice gaining strength as though she'd found her footing in familiar moral territory. We don't let family get hurt when we have the power to help them. That's not who we raised you to be. The words stung because I recognized the manipulation in them, the way she framed my potential refusal as a character flaw rather than a reasonable boundary. My cousin Derek cleared his throat uncomfortably. Maybe I should head out, he said, standing and gathering his keys. The moment had shifted from family dinner to family business, and everyone could feel it. Within minutes, the extended relatives had found reasons to leave. Aunt Patricia kissed my cheek and whispered, "You're a good girl, Maureen. You'll figure it out." When the house emptied, only the 3 of us remained. My parents and me, sitting in the living room that suddenly felt enormous and suffocating at the same time. The photos on the mantel seemed to watch us, decades of family Memories presiding over this moment that would define our relationships going forward. "I know it's unfair," my mother said into the silence. "I know you worked hard for that house. But Bethany is in real danger, and we're out of options." She looked older than I'd ever seen her, worn down by the constant cycle of my sister's crises and the weight of trying to hold the family together through each one. My father nodded slowly. "If there was any other way, we wouldn't ask. But the bank won't give us another loan, and we've already mortgaged everything we own. You're the only one with assets they can't touch." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Yet. But more than the physical space, I thought about what that house represented. Independence. Security. The proof that I could take care of myself without depending on anyone else's chaos or poor choices. For the first time in my life, I had something that was completely mine, untouched by family drama or someone else's financial emergencies." "I need time to think," I said finally, standing from the couch. My mother's face fell slightly, as though she'd expected immediate agreement. My father nodded, but I could see the disappointment in his expression. "Of course," my mother said, though her tone suggested that thinking was a luxury we couldn't afford. "But don't take too long. Every day we wait makes it worse for her." I kissed them both goodnight, gathered my purse and jacket, and walked toward the front door. Behind me, I could hear them beginning to whisper, probably planning their next approach, their next argument for why I should sacrifice my security for Bethany's mistakes. Inside, the house welcomed me with the familiar scent of the vanilla candles I'd burned that morning and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water, stood at the sink, and looked out at the backyard through the window over the basin. Moonlight cast shadows across the lawn I'd been slowly transforming, section by section, into something beautiful. This was mine. Not jointly owned, not gifted, not inherited. Mine through years of careful choices and sacrifices they'd never bothered to notice or acknowledge. While Bethany had been spending money on designer clothes and weekend trips to Vegas, I'd been eating ramen and clipping coupons. While she'd been dating men who borrowed money she didn't have, I'd been working late shifts and building my credit score point by careful point, and now, when her choices had finally caught up with her, the solution was simple. I should give up mine. Every corner of this house told the story of someone who'd earned what she had. And tomorrow, I'd have to decide whether that story mattered more than keeping peace with people who'd never learned to write their own. I sat down at the kitchen table where I paid bills every month, pulled out my laptop, and opened the folder labeled financial documents. Bank statements, mortgage papers, insurance policies, investment accounts. All of it organized with the same methodical attention I brought to my clients' books. Numbers that represented not just money, but choices. Years of choosing security over impulse, planning over spontaneity. As I scrolled through the figures, I realized something that my parents hadn't considered in their desperation to save Bethany. The equity in my house wasn't just sitting there waiting to be harvested. It was the foundation of everything I'd built. My mortgage payment was lower than rent would be for a comparable place. The stability of ownership had allowed me to expand my freelance practice, bringing clients to meetings in my home office instead of renting commercial space, but there was something else they didn't know, something I'd learned from watching their previous attempts to bail Bethany out of increasingly expensive mistakes. This wouldn't be the end. It would be the beginning of a pattern where my resources became the family's emergency fund, where my sacrifices became the expected solution to problems I'd never created. The phone would ring tomorrow. Probably early, before I'd had my coffee. Before I'd had time to strengthen my resolve for the conversation that was coming. My mother would call first, her voice heavy with worry about Bethany's situation and disappointment in my hesitation. Then my father would try, using logic and family obligations to pressure me toward the outcome they'd already decided was inevitable. The pattern was clear to everyone except the people who kept feeding it. Bethany would take the money from my house, promise it was the last time, swear she'd learned her lesson, and within a year, there would be another crisis. Another emergency that required family intervention, another situation where her poor choices became everyone else's problems. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos I'd taken during the house hunting process 2 years earlier. Dozens of properties I'd toured, each one eliminated for practical reasons. Too expensive, too small, wrong neighborhood, needed too much work. The house on Maple Street had been the exception, the one that met every criteria on my carefully constructed list. The closing had been the most terrifying and exhilarating day of my adult life. Sitting at a conference table downtown, signing document after document, watching my savings account drain in exchange for a set of keys and a deed with my name printed in official legal text. Maureen Patricia Wells, sole owner. No co-signers. No family gifts, no inheritance. Just me and a 30-year commitment to build something stable. Walking into the empty house that first night, my footsteps echoing off bare walls, I'd felt the weight of complete responsibility settle on my shoulders. Every repair, every improvement, every monthly payment would be mine to handle. But so would every decision, every change, every moment of pride when I looked around and saw what I'd accomplished. The house had become more than shelter. It was my proof of concept, evidence that the financial discipline I'd learned in reaction to my family's chaos could create something lasting. While they lurched from crisis to crisis, I'd been building equity and stability. While Bethany spent money she didn't have on things she didn't need, I'd been investing in a future that belonged entirely to me. Now they wanted to liquidate that future to pay for her mistakes, and they couldn't understand why I wouldn't see it as a simple family obligation. To them, my house was just another asset to be redistributed when emergencies arose. To me, it was the cornerstone of a life I'd built specifically to avoid the financial volatility that had defined my childhood. I remembered being 16, sitting in this same living room while my parents argued about money in the kitchen. Bethany's car payment was late again, and they were debating whether to cover it or let her deal with the consequences. They'd covered it, of course. They always did. And each time they bailed her out, they reinforced the lesson that her choices didn't have to make sense because someone else would handle the fallout. I'd made a different choice. I'd learned to live below my means, to save first and spend what was left, to think 3 steps ahead before making any major decision. The habits had felt restrictive at first, like wearing clothes that were slightly too small. But over time, they'd created space for opportunities that people like Bethany never saw coming. The house was just the most visible symbol of that approach. But it represented something deeper, a commitment to building rather than just surviving, to creating rather than just reacting. They were asking me to abandon that philosophy for someone who'd never embraced it herself. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. "Thank you for listening tonight. I know this is hard. We love you." The words were kind, but I could read the subtext. The decision had already been made in their minds. They were just waiting for me to accept what they saw as inevitable. I set the phone aside and walked downstairs to the living room where I kept my financial planning binders. 3 thick folders organized by category: mortgage documents, investment statements, insurance policies, tax returns. Everything documented, everything in its place. The habits of someone who'd learned that preparation was the only reliable defense against chaos. Selling the house wouldn't just cost me the equity. It would force me into a rental market where prices had climbed 30% in the past year, eating up the exact amount I'd theoretically save Bethany. The net result would be me losing everything I'd worked for while she learned nothing about the consequences of her choices. But explaining this to my parents would require them to see my financial life as something more complex than a simple savings account they could tap in emergencies. It would require them to acknowledge that I'd built something worth protecting, not just accumulated money worth redistributing. I closed the binders and sat back on my couch, the same spot where I'd celebrated getting the house keys 6 months earlier. The memory felt distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. That night, I'd called my best friend Sarah to share the news, ordered pizza as a celebration dinner, and fallen asleep planning which room to tackle first. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Tonight, I was planning something different. Not renovations or improvements, but defenses. Ways to protect what I'd built from people who loved me enough to destroy it for someone else. Monday morning arrived with rain drumming against my bedroom windows and the insistent buzzing of my phone on the nightstand. 3 missed calls from my mother, 2 from my father, and a string of text messages that grew increasingly urgent as the hours passed. "Call me when you get this. We need to talk today. Bethany's situation is getting worse." I set the phone aside and went through my normal routine. Coffee first, then a quick scan of my client emails while the caffeine worked its way into my system. The familiar rhythm of Monday morning tasks felt like armor against the emotional storm brewing in my family. Numbers didn't lie or manipulate or guilt you into decisions you weren't ready to make. They simply existed, waiting for logical analysis. By the time I'd finished my second cup of coffee, the phone had buzzed 6 more times. I finally answered, knowing that avoidance would only escalate their panic into something more dramatic. "This isn't about your little bookkeeping business," she interrupted, her voice sharp with frustration. "This is about family. About Bethany's life being in danger while you sit there counting pennies for other people." The dismissal stung more than I expected. My little bookkeeping business had grown into a practice that served 37 small businesses across the Portland metro area. It wasn't little, and it wasn't something I could abandon for family drama. "We're coming over," she continued before I could respond. "Your father and I will be there in 20 minutes. We need to discuss this face to face." The line went dead. Before I could object, leaving me staring at my phone in the quiet office I'd carefully designed for productivity and peace. 23 minutes later, my parents' burgundy sedan pulled into the driveway with the urgent speed of people on a mission. Through my front window, I watched them hurry up the walkway, my father carrying a manila folder thick with documents, my mother clutching her purse like it contained evidence for a trial. I opened the door before they could knock, stepping aside. As they bustled into my entryway with the determination of people who'd spent the drive planning their approach. My father's face was drawn and serious, while my mother moved with the restless energy of someone who'd been awake most of the night worrying. I stared at him, processing what he'd just said. He'd researched loans on my property without asking my permission, spoken to financial institutions about my assets as though they were community resources waiting to be allocated. The presumption was breathtaking, but it also revealed how completely they'd already decided my role in solving Bethany's crisis. My mother leaned forward, her expression softening into the face she'd worn when trying to convince me to share toys with Bethany as children. Sweetheart, I know this feels unfair. But think about what really matters here. Family. Love. Taking care of each other when times get hard. She gestured around my living room. This is just a house. Bethany is your sister. The reduction was stunning in its simplicity. Years of sacrifice, planning, and careful financial management condensed into just a house, while Bethany's pattern of destructive choices was elevated to a family emergency that trumped everything else. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, not anger but recognition. This was who they'd always been, who I'd somehow forgotten in the warmth of Sunday dinners and holiday traditions. What happens next time? I asked quietly. Both of them looked confused, as though the question didn't make sense. When Bethany has another crisis, another debt, another emergency that requires family intervention. What happens when the money from my house is gone and she needs help again? My mother's face hardened. That's not going to happen. She's learned her lesson this time. She's scared, Maureen. Really scared. This experience will change her. The words carried the weight of repetition, the same promise they'd made after every previous bailout. Bethany would learn, Bethany would change, Bethany would be more responsible now that she understood the consequences of her actions, except the consequences never actually reached her. They always landed on someone else, absorbed by family members. Who prioritized peace over accountability, who enabled her choices by cushioning every fall. The fear in her voice was real, but it was layered over something else. The same manipulative undertone she'd used since childhood when she needed something from me. The tears were genuine, but they were being deployed strategically, weapons in a campaign to get what she wanted. I've already talked to a financial counselor, she continued, as though reading from a script. I have a plan to get my life together, to never let this happen again. But I need help getting out of this hole first. Just this once, Maureen. I swear it's the last time I'll ever ask for anything. I'd heard variations of this speech before. After the credit card debt in college, after the loan she'd taken out for a car she couldn't afford, after the money she'd borrowed from our grandmother's estate that was supposed to go toward medical bills. Each time, she'd promised it was the last time. Each time, she'd been convincing enough that someone believed her. How much have you already gotten from Mom and Dad? I asked, cutting through her prepared monologue. Silence stretched across the line, long enough for glances to be exchanged in my living room. Finally, Bethany spoke, her voice smaller than before. They gave me what they could, she said carefully. But it wasn't enough. The amount keeps growing because of interest and fees. If I don't pay the full balance soon, it's going to get much worse. The evasion was masterful, answering my question without providing any actual numbers. I could see my parents watching me, waiting for Bethany's performance to soften my resistance. I'm not asking you to give me the money, Bethany continued, gaining confidence as she sensed I wasn't immediately hanging up. It would be a loan. I'd pay you back as soon as I get on my feet. Maybe we could work out a payment plan, something that doesn't hurt your budget. The offer was designed to sound reasonable, responsible, different from her previous requests for help, but I knew the math. Even if Bethany managed to stick to a payment plan, which her history suggested was unlikely, I'd still be carrying the full financial risk. My credit would be extended, my equity depleted, my financial stability compromised for years while she theoretically learned to manage money she'd never had to earn the hard way. I need to think about it, I said finally, and Bethany's voice immediately shifted back to desperation. Please don't take too long. I'm really scared, Maureen. These aren't people who wait for convenient timing. The call ended with promises to talk soon and reminders of how much she loved and appreciated me. My parents sat in the silence that followed, both of them studying my face for signs of softening. My mother was the first to speak, her voice gentle but insistent. You heard her. She's terrified. And she has a plan this time, a real plan to turn things around. My father nodded, shuffling through his papers until he found what he was looking for. I've already researched the process. Equity loans can close in as little as 2 weeks if you have good credit, which you do. The monthly payment increase would be manageable, probably less than what most people spend on entertainment. He slid a printed calculation across the table toward me. I glanced at the numbers without picking up the paper. He'd calculated conservatively, assuming the minimum interest rate and the longest possible repayment term. The monthly increase looked small on paper, but he hadn't factored in the risk of carrying debt for someone with Bethany's track record, or the psychological weight of knowing that my financial security was now tied to her ability to change patterns she'd never successfully changed before. This isn't just about the money, I said, trying to find words that would help them understand what they were really asking. It's about enabling a cycle that's never going to stop unless someone stops feeding it. My mother's expression tightened, the way it always did when I suggested that helping Bethany might not actually be helping her. She's your sister, my mother said, as though biology trumped logic, as though shared genetics created an obligation that overrode individual judgment. Family means sacrificing for each other when necessary. It means putting love ahead of money. The moral framework was familiar and designed to make disagreement seem selfish, cruel, unfamiliar, but I'd heard it before, used to justify every previous bailout, every time they'd chosen to protect Bethany from consequences rather than help her learn to avoid them. The love they talked about was conditional, contingent on my willingness to absorb financial damage for someone who'd never learned to avoid creating it. My father tried a different approach, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he'd used when teaching me to balance a checkbook as a teenager. Look, I understand your concerns. But sometimes in life, you have to take calculated risks for the people you care about. You're smart with money, smarter than any of us. You'll figure out how to make this work. The compliment was meant to flatter me into compliance, to make my financial skills seem like a resource that belonged to the family rather than abilities I'd developed for my own protection. But there was something else in his tone, something that suggested my smartness was supposed to be used in service of other people's poor choices rather than my own long-term security. What if I can't make it work? I asked. What if taking on this debt compromises my ability to maintain the house, or forces me to cut back on retirement savings, or limits my options if I have an emergency of my own? The questions hung in the air, practical concerns they hadn't considered because they'd been focused entirely on Bethany's immediate crisis. My mother looked frustrated, as though I was deliberately complicating something that should be simple. You're young, she said dismissively. You have time to recover from any setbacks. Bethany doesn't have time. Every day we wait makes her situation more dangerous. The age argument was new, and it revealed another layer of their reasoning. Because I was younger, my financial stability was less important, more replaceable. Because I had time, my current security could be sacrificed for someone else's urgent needs. The logic was both insulting and revealing, showing how little they understood about the foundation I'd built and how long it had taken to construct. My phone buzzed with another call, this one from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, but my parents both noticed the hesitation. That could be important, my father said. Maybe you should take it. I shook my head, focused on the conversation we needed to finish before taking on any new complications, but the missed call seemed to energize them, as though it might be related to Bethany's situation, another reminder of the urgency that required immediate action. My mother stood and began pacing near my front window, her nervous energy filling the room with tension. I don't think you understand how serious this is, she said, her voice gaining volume. These people don't care about payment plans or family meetings. They want their money, and if they don't get it, Bethany could end up in the hospital. Or worse. The escalation was designed to override rational discussion, to make my concerns about financial stability seem trivial compared to physical safety, but I'd learned to recognize emotional manipulation disguised as urgent facts. How serious was Bethany's situation, really? How much of the danger was real, and how much was theatrical, designed to create the pressure necessary to extract money from family members who'd learned to respond to crisis with their checkbooks? Has she filed a police report about these threats? I asked. Both my parents looked uncomfortable with the question, exchanging the kind of glance that suggested they'd discussed this possibility and dismissed it for reasons they didn't want to explain. The police can't help with private debts, my father said finally. And involving law enforcement might make things worse for her. The reasoning was convenient and probably inaccurate, but it served their purpose of keeping the crisis within family bounds where emotional pressure could be more effective than legal solutions. The conversation continued in circles for another hour, with my parents presenting variations of the same arguments while I asked questions they couldn't or wouldn't answer. How exactly had Bethany accumulated this debt? Why hadn't she come to them before it reached crisis levels? What was her Plan for avoiding similar situations in the future? Each question was met with deflection or irritation, as though seeking details was an unnecessary delay in the face of obvious urgency. Finally, my mother played what she clearly thought was her strongest card. "Fine," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "If you won't help your sister voluntarily, then I guess we know what kind of person you've become." She began gathering her purse and jacket with the slow, deliberate movements of someone performing grief for an audience. "Money has changed you, Maureen. Success has made you selfish. The daughter I raised would never let her sister suffer when she had the power to help." The guilt was expertly applied, designed to make me question not just my decision but my fundamental character, my worthiness as a family member and human being. My father stood as well, but his approach was different, more calculated. "Think about how you'll feel if something happens to her," he said quietly. "Think about living with that knowledge, knowing you could have prevented it." He left the papers scattered across my coffee table, evidence of their research and planning, documents I hadn't asked for but was now expected to study and accept. After they left, the house felt different, contaminated by their visit and the emotions they'd brought into my carefully maintained space. I gathered the papers they'd left behind, scanning through bank loan applications with my name pre-filled, calculations based on property values they'd researched without my knowledge, timelines that assumed my cooperation was inevitable. The paperwork revealed the depth of their planning, the extent to which they'd already committed me to a course of action I hadn't agreed to. They'd done everything except forge my signature, laying the groundwork for a transaction that would fundamentally change my financial position based on their assessment of family obligations. I was putting the papers into a pile when my phone rang again, the same unknown number from earlier. This time I answered, curiosity overriding caution. "Maureen Wells?" The voice was female, professional, unfamiliar. I ended the call and sat in the sudden quiet of my office, anger building like pressure behind my ribs. They'd all been working together, my parents and Bethany, coordinating their approach, sharing information and strategies designed to corner me into compliance. The family meeting wasn't a discussion, it was the final step in a campaign that had been running for weeks without my knowledge. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Derek. "Hey, heard about the family situation. Tough spot. Call me if you need to talk to someone who gets it." The message was unexpected, and the phrase, "someone who gets it," suggested he understood something about the dynamics that my parents had either missed or ignored. I called him back immediately, needing perspective from someone who knew the family history but wasn't emotionally invested in the current crisis. Derek answered on the second ring, his voice warm but cautious. "I was wondering when you'd call. Mom told me about the whole situation with Bethany and your house." The validation was unexpected and powerful, coming from someone who'd watched the family dynamics from close enough to see the patterns but far enough away to maintain perspective. "Everyone else is afraid to say no to her because they don't want to be the bad guy. But someone has to, or she'll never learn to handle her own problems." After we hung up, I sat in my office staring at the papers my parents had left behind, seeing them differently now. Not just loan applications and calculations, but evidence of how thoroughly they'd planned to solve Bethany's problems using my resources. The presumption was staggering, but it also revealed something important about how they viewed my role in the family hierarchy. I was the responsible one, the practical one, the one who could be counted on to sacrifice her own interests for the greater family good. But I was also the one whose feelings and boundaries mattered least, whose success was treated as a community asset rather than individual achievement. But stability worked both ways. The same discipline that had allowed me to buy a house had also taught me to recognize patterns, to plan ahead, to protect what I'd built from people who might destroy it out of love or good intentions. And as I gathered the loan applications into a neat pile, I realized I'd been preparing for this conversation longer than I'd consciously admitted. The next phone call would be different. The next family meeting would find me ready with answers they wouldn't expect, boundaries they hadn't anticipated, and a clarity about my role that would surprise everyone, including myself. Tuesday started before my alarm clock had the chance to wake me. The phone rang at 6:15 in the morning, jarring me from sleep with the urgent rhythm of someone who'd been awake all night planning their next move. I recognized my mother's number but let it go to voicemail, needing coffee and clear thinking. Before facing whatever escalation she'd prepared during the sleepless hours, the voicemail was 2 minutes of barely controlled panic. Bethany had called them crying at 4 in the morning, reporting that someone had been sitting in a car outside her apartment building when she got home from her evening shift at the restaurant. The person hadn't approached or threatened her directly, but their presence had been unmistakable, deliberately menacing. "She's terrified to go to work today," my mother's recorded voice pleaded. "These people are escalating because they know the deadline is approaching." Before I could decide how to respond, my phone rang again. This time it was my father, his voice heavy with the exhaustion of people who'd been managing crisis for 2 Long. Maureen, we need to move faster on this. The situation has changed overnight. His words carried an urgency that felt manufactured, as though the timing of Bethany's scare was convenient enough to seem orchestrated. Have you called the police? I asked, the same question I'd posed during their visit to my house. My father's. Pause was long enough to be telling. Bethany doesn't want to involve law enforcement. She's worried it might make things worse. The explanation was identical to the one they'd given before, circular reasoning that eliminated practical solutions while emphasizing emotional ones. But you could solve this today, he continued, his tone shifting toward persuasion. I've already contacted the bank. They can expedite the equity loan process if you provide income verification and sign the initial paperwork. We could have the money in Bethany's hands by Friday. The speed of his planning was impressive and concerning, revealing how much preparation had gone into pressuring me toward their preferred solution. I ended the call with promises to consider their urgency and spent the next hour going through my morning routine with deliberate slowness. Shower, coffee, breakfast, review of my daily schedule. Normal activities that felt like resistance against the chaos my family was trying to inject into my carefully ordered life. By 9 o'clock, my office phone was ringing with my first client call of the day. Margaret Foster from the veterinary clinic needed help reconciling her quarterly tax payments with a new payroll system that had been calculating deductions incorrectly. The problem was complex but solvable, requiring attention to detail and systematic analysis of overlapping accounting systems. Working on Margaret's books felt like therapy, a reminder that most financial problems had logical solutions when approached with patience and expertise. Numbers didn't manipulate or guilt or pressure. They simply presented facts that could be analyzed and addressed through methodical processes. I was deep into the reconciliation when my doorbell rang, followed immediately by insistent knocking. Through the window, I could see my Aunt Patricia on the front porch, her expression serious and determined. Behind her stood my Uncle Raymond, hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking uncomfortable but present. I need to call you back, Margaret. I said into the phone. Family emergency. The irony wasn't lost on me. The actual emergency was my family's inability to accept that I wasn't going to fund Bethany's latest crisis, but their presence at my door suggested they'd escalated their campaign to include extended relatives. Patricia embraced me the moment I opened the door, the kind of hug that felt more like containment than affection. Honey, we came as soon as we heard about the situation, she said, steering me toward my own living room as though she lived there. Raymond and I have been talking all morning about how we can help. The phrase, how we can help, apparently meant how to convince Maureen to liquidate her assets, because the conversation that followed was a carefully orchestrated presentation of new arguments designed to overcome my resistance. Patricia had brought photo albums, apparently planning to remind me of every family vacation, holiday gathering, and childhood memory that might create emotional leverage. Look at this, she said, opening to a page of pictures from my high school graduation. Your whole family was so proud of you that day. We knew you were going to do something special with your life. She turned the page to show more photos, my parents beaming as I accepted academic awards, family celebrations centered around my achievements. We've always supported your success, Patricia continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a prepared speech. When you needed help with college applications, when you wanted to take that accounting course, when you were looking for your first apartment. We were there for you. The implication was clear: past support created current obligations. Family investment in my success meant I owed returns when they needed them. Raymond contributed his own perspective, focusing on practical concerns rather than emotional ones. Patricia and I looked at the numbers your father showed us. The equity loan really wouldn't hurt your monthly budget that much. You're already paying mortgage, insurance, utilities. Adding $200 a month for a few years isn't going to change your lifestyle significantly. His analysis ignored every factor beyond the immediate payment increase. The psychological stress of carrying debt for someone else's poor choices, the reduced financial flexibility for handling my own emergencies, the precedent it would set for future family crises. To him, the decision was purely mathematical, a simple cost-benefit calculation that didn't include emotional or strategic considerations. Besides, Patricia added, closing the photo album with a satisfied expression, it's not like you'd be giving the money away. It's a loan. Bethany will pay you back once she gets stable. And in the meantime, you'll actually be earning interest on the equity instead of just letting it sit there doing nothing. The financial advice was spectacularly wrong, revealing how little they understood about home equity, loan terms, or risk assessment. But correcting their misconceptions would require explaining concepts they didn't want to understand, details that complicated their simple narrative about family obligation and sisterly love. My phone buzzed with a text message from Bethany herself. Thank you for considering helping me. I know it's a big ask. Can we meet today to talk through the details? I want you to know how serious I am about paying you back and turning my life around. The message was perfectly timed to arrive during Patricia and Raymond's visit, adding weight to their emotional appeals. See? Patricia said, reading over my shoulder without permission. She's ready to make changes. She just needs someone to believe in her enough to give her a chance. The interpretation was generous to the point of fantasy, transforming Bethany's desperate request for money into evidence of personal growth and commitment to change, but I'd seen this script before. Played out with different family members during previous crises. Bethany's promises of change, delivered with tears and sincerity, followed by months of improved behavior, then gradual backsliding into the same patterns that had created the original crisis. The cycle was predictable enough to feel choreographed. Patricia and Raymond stayed for another hour, tag-teaming their persuasion efforts like experienced salespeople working a reluctant customer. When emotional appeals didn't work, they tried practical arguments. When guilt proved insufficient, they shifted to fear about what would happen to family relationships if I refused to help. Think about Christmas, Patricia said as they prepared to leave. Think about family gatherings for the rest of your life, knowing that you could have helped your sister when she needed you most but chose not to. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. My refusal would be remembered, discussed, held against me at every future family event. After they left, I called Dr. Richardson's office and scheduled an emergency session for Thursday afternoon. I needed professional perspective on the escalating pressure tactics and guidance on maintaining my boundaries as the family campaign intensified. The receptionist mentioned that Dr. Richardson had specifically requested I call if family financial issues resurfaced, as though she'd been expecting this exact scenario. Wednesday brought a new approach: surprise visitors. My cousin Sarah arrived during my lunch break, ostensibly to catch up but clearly carrying a message from the extended family. She'd driven down from Seattle specifically to see me, leaving her own job and family responsibilities to participate in what was becoming a coordinated intervention. Everyone's talking about Bethany's situation, Sarah said, settling into my kitchen with the familiarity of someone who'd spent childhood summers in my parents' house. The whole family is worried about her safety, but also about you. About how this decision might affect your relationships with everyone you love. The phrasing was expertly manipulative, suggesting that my choice was between helping Bethany and maintaining family connections, as though love was contingent on financial compliance. Sarah had always been more sophisticated in her approach than my parents, using subtlety where they relied on direct pressure. I've been in similar situations, she continued, stirring sugar into the coffee I'd reluctantly offered. When Mark lost his job 3 years ago, we had to make hard choices about helping his brother with mortgage payments. It wasn't easy, but family comes first. The analogy was flawed but persuasive, creating a false parallel between helping an unemployed relative and funding a gambling addict's debt to loan sharks. The thing is, Sarah said, leaning forward conspiratorially, everyone understands why you're hesitant. Money is scary to lose, especially when you've worked so hard for it. But think about the regret you'll feel if something happens to Bethany and you could have prevented it. The emotional manipulation was expertly deployed, framing my refusal as a choice I'd have to live with forever if the worst-case scenario materialized. That evening, my phone started ringing in sequence. Different family members calling every 30 minutes, each with their own version of why I should reconsider my position. My grandmother's sister from Bend, my cousin Michael from California, even my Uncle Tom who'd never shown interest in family financial matters before. The coordination was obvious and overwhelming, a full-court press designed to make me feel isolated in my resistance. Each caller had been briefed on my objections and came prepared with counterarguments. When I mentioned that lending money to family members often destroyed relationships, they reminded me that refusing to help would definitely destroy relationships. When I expressed concern about enabling Bethany's gambling habits, they insisted this crisis would force her to change her behavior permanently. The most effective call came from my grandmother, my father's mother, who'd always held special status in family decisions. Her voice was frail but determined as she explained that she'd already given Bethany her life insurance policy, borrowing against the death benefit to provide what little she could. I don't have much time left, she said with the calculated fragility of someone playing her strongest emotional card. I'd like to know that my granddaughters will take care of each other when I'm gone. The guilt was expertly applied, connecting my decision about the house to my relationship with my grandmother and my worthiness as a granddaughter. But there was something else in her tone, a rehearsed quality that suggested someone had coached her on what to say and how to say it for maximum emotional impact. Thursday's session with Dr. Richardson provided the perspective I needed to understand what was happening. This is classic family systems manipulation, she explained, reviewing the notes I'd taken about each conversation. When individual pressure doesn't work, families often escalate to group pressure, making the target feel isolated and outnumbered. She helped me recognize that the sequence of calls hadn't been organic expressions of family concern, but a coordinated campaign designed to overwhelm my ability to maintain boundaries under emotional stress. Each person is playing a role, she explained. The practical advisor, the emotional manipulator, the authority figure, the guilt specialist. Together, they create a web of pressure that's difficult to resist without advanced preparation. But Dr. Richardson also pointed out something I hadn't noticed. Your family is treating this like a negotiation, which means they believe you might eventually say yes. If they truly understood your position, they'd be focusing on alternative solutions rather than escalating pressure. The observation was both validating and strategic, suggesting that my continued resistance might eventually force them to consider the resources I'd compiled. That evening, I made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. I called a family meeting for Saturday afternoon, to be held at my house where I controlled the environment and agenda. Not a spontaneous intervention or surprise visit, but a formal discussion where I could present my position clearly and offer concrete alternatives to their preferred solution. The preparation was meticulous. I arranged my living room to discourage lingering, putting away anything valuable or personally meaningful that might be used as emotional leverage. I prepared copies of the resource list for everyone who planned to attend, along with a brief summary of why professional help would be more effective than family financial intervention. Most importantly, I drafted a brief statement of my position, written with Catherine's guidance and reviewed by Dr. Richardson. The document was clear, compassionate, and final. It acknowledged the seriousness of Bethany's situation while explaining why my house wasn't the appropriate solution and offering specific alternatives that addressed the underlying problems rather than just the immediate crisis. Friday brought the most aggressive pressure yet. My mother showed up at my office without warning, arriving during my busiest client consultation hours with red eyes and the appearance of someone who'd been crying for most of the morning. She sat in my waiting area, sobbing quietly while I finished a phone conference with a restaurant owner who needed emergency bookkeeping help before a bank meeting. The display was designed to make me feel heartless for conducting business while family drama unfolded in my professional space. When I finally invited her into my office, she could barely speak through her tears. She tried to hurt herself last night, my mother whispered. Bethany took pills. Not enough to do real damage, but enough to scare us. The revelation hit like a physical blow, exactly as it was intended to. Suicide threats or attempts were the nuclear option in family manipulation, designed to override rational decision-making with pure emotional terror. But something about the timing and presentation felt calculated, as though the incident had been designed to create maximum pressure rather than reflect genuine despair. Is she getting professional help? I asked, reaching for my phone to call emergency services or crisis intervention. My mother quickly shook her head, reaching across my desk to stop me from dialing. She's fine now. She's staying with us where we can watch her. But this proves how desperate she's become. These threats from the loan sharks are pushing her toward choices that could destroy our family permanently. The narrative was expertly constructed, connecting my refusal to help financially with Bethany's mental health crisis, making me responsible for preventing future self-harm. But there were holes in the story that became obvious when I asked for details. Which hospital had she gone to? What kind of pills? Had they contacted her primary care physician or a mental health professional? Each question was met with vague responses or irritation that I was focusing on logistics rather than the emotional reality of family members in crisis. Sometimes I don't recognize who you've become, my mother said when I pressed for specifics. The Maureen I raised would drop everything to help her sister, not sit here asking questions like a lawyer trying to find loopholes. The attack was personal and designed to make me question my character rather than the inconsistencies in their story. After she left, I sat in my office staring at the stack of client files that represented my actual responsibilities, the people who paid me to manage their financial concerns with competence and integrity. The contrast was stark between the chaos my family brought and the orderly problem-solving my professional life required. My afternoon was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Bethany herself stood on my front porch, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd seen her in years. Her eyes were puffy from crying, her clothes wrinkled as though she'd slept in them, and she carried herself with the defeated posture of someone who'd exhausted all other options. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. "I know everyone has been pressuring you, and I wanted to talk to you myself, without Mom and Dad managing the conversation." The request seemed reasonable, even mature, suggesting that she understood the family dynamics were complicating an already difficult situation. I led her to my living room, offered tea that she declined, and waited for whatever speech she'd prepared. But instead of immediate manipulation, Bethany surprised me by looking around my house with genuine appreciation. "You've done such a beautiful job with this place," she said, running her finger along the edge of my coffee table. "I remember when you first showed me the listing photos. You were so excited about having your own space." The acknowledgement was unexpected and disarming, recognizing the emotional significance of the house rather than just its financial value. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that this conversation might be different, more honest than the scripted presentations I'd been receiving from other family members. "I know what everyone is asking you to do," Bethany continued, her voice steady but sad. "And I know how unfair it must feel. You've worked so hard for this house, saved for years, made sacrifices I never made. The last thing I wanted was for my problems to threaten what you've built." The empathy was compelling, and I felt my defensive barriers shifting slightly in response to what seemed like genuine understanding. But something about her tone reminded me of the acting classes she'd taken in community college, the way she'd practiced emotional scenes until they felt natural and spontaneous. "But I'm desperate, Maureen. Really desperate in ways I've never been before." Her voice began to crack, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "These people aren't like the collection agencies I've dealt with before. They don't send letters or make phone calls during business hours. They show up at your work, they follow you home, they make sure you know that your safety depends on their patience." The fear seemed genuine, but it was layered over something else I couldn't quite identify. A performance quality that suggested she'd practiced this conversation, rehearsed the emotional beats until they felt authentic. "I've never asked you for money before," she continued, which was technically true but ignored the many times she'd asked our parents for money that had ultimately come from family resources I'd contributed to. "This isn't about you bailing me out of poor choices," Bethany said, anticipating my objections. "This is about saving my life. Literally saving my life from people who don't care about payment plans or family circumstances." The escalation was designed to eliminate any middle ground, making the choice between giving her money and accepting responsibility for potential violence. But even as she spoke, I noticed details that didn't align with someone in genuine fear for their safety. Her nails were freshly manicured, painted in an expensive shade that required salon application. Her handbag was new, leather that looked soft and costly. Her phone case sparkled with what appeared to be real crystals arranged in a decorative pattern. These weren't the accessories of someone who'd been cutting expenses to address a financial crisis, or someone so terrified of loan sharks that they'd stopped spending money on non-essentials. They were the choices of someone who continued prioritizing appearance and immediate gratification even while claiming to be in mortal danger from creditors. "I've already talked to a financial counselor," Bethany said, as though reading my thoughts. "I have a complete plan for getting my finances back on track. But I need help getting out of this immediate hole before I can start implementing long-term changes." The claim was identical to what she'd told my parents, but delivered with the conviction of someone who'd convinced herself it was true. "What does the financial counselor recommend?" I asked, genuinely curious about professional advice that didn't involve liquidating family members' assets. Bethany's pause was slight but noticeable. "She says the most important thing is to resolve the immediate debt crisis before working on spending habits and long-term planning." The response was vague enough to be meaningless, offering no specific recommendations or concrete steps beyond obtaining money from relatives. If Bethany had actually consulted with a financial professional, the advice would have included detailed strategies for debt negotiation, income increase, expense reduction, and legal protections. Instead, she was repeating phrases that sounded professional without containing any actionable content. Our conversation continued for another hour, with Bethany cycling through different emotional approaches designed to find the pressure point that would change my mind. She tried sisterly affection, reminiscing about childhood memories and shared experiences. She attempted practical reasoning, explaining how the loan would actually benefit me through interest payments and tax deductions. She deployed fear, describing increasingly vivid scenarios about what might happen if I refused to help, but underneath all the tactics, I could sense something else, surprised that I wasn't immediately agreeing to their requests. She'd been assured by our parents that I would eventually comply, that my resistance was temporary and would crumble under sufficient family pressure. My continued refusal was disrupting a plan that had assumed my cooperation was inevitable. "I don't understand why you're being so stubborn about this," she said finally, her mask of vulnerable desperation slipping to reveal frustration underneath. "It's not like you need every penny of equity immediately. You're single, you don't have kids, you don't have major expenses planned. What's the worst that could happen if you help me?" The question revealed everything I needed to know about how my life was perceived by my family. Because I was single, my financial security was less important. Because I didn't have children, my future planning was less legitimate. Because my Expenses were predictable and manageable. My resources were available for redistribution to family members who'd managed their finances less successfully. The assumptions were both insulting and illuminating, showing how little they understood about the foundation I'd built and why it was worth protecting. They saw my stability as evidence that I could afford to take risks, rather than recognizing it as the result of careful choices that shouldn't be abandoned for someone else's emergencies. I need to think about everything we've discussed, I said finally, standing to signal that the conversation was ending. Bethany looked surprised, as though she'd expected her personal appeal to be more persuasive than our parents' pressure tactics. "How long do you need?" she asked, gathering her purse and jacket with reluctant movements. "Because time really is running out. These people aren't going to wait for family meetings and financial planning sessions." The urgency was relentless, designed to prevent the careful consideration that might lead to alternative solutions. "I'll have an answer for everyone on Saturday," I said, opening the front door with the finality of someone who'd made a decision. "About timing if not content." At the family meeting I called. 2:00. "Everyone can hear my position at the same time." Bethany's expression shifted through surprise, concern, and something that might have been respect. She'd expected to negotiate privately, to use personal connection as leverage away from family oversight. The prospect of a formal meeting where everyone would hear the same information clearly wasn't part of the script she'd been following. That evening, I spent 3 hours reviewing every document Catherine had prepared, every strategy Dr. Richardson had recommended, every alternative resource I'd compiled for situations exactly like this one. The preparation felt like studying for the most important exam of my adult life, a test that would determine not just my financial future but my role in family relationships going forward. I also did something I'd never done before. I started documenting every conversation, every pressure tactic, every attempt to manipulate my decision through guilt, fear, or emotional blackmail. The record wasn't for legal purposes but for clarity, helping me see the pattern of manipulation that was harder to recognize when experienced one conversation at a time. The documentation revealed something disturbing. My family wasn't just asking for help with a crisis. They were systematically dismantling my ability to say no, using every relationship, memory, and emotional connection as leverage to override my judgment about my own financial decisions. The campaign was comprehensive and coordinated, designed to make refusal seem impossible rather than reasonable, but they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that pressure would weaken my resolve, that isolation and guilt would eventually force compliance. Instead, their tactics had clarified exactly what I was protecting and why it was worth protecting. Every manipulative conversation strengthened my understanding that saying no wasn't selfish but necessary. Not just for my financial health but for the long-term well-being of family relationships that had become dangerously unbalanced. As I prepared for bed Thursday night, I felt something settle inside me that hadn't been there at the beginning of the week. Not anger or resentment, but clarity about boundaries and consequences, about love and enabling, about the difference between helping someone and funding their refusal to help themselves. Saturday would bring the confrontation I'd been preparing for without realizing it, and I was finally ready to have it. Saturday arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn in Portland, the kind of day when everything felt sharp-edged and definitive. I'd spent the morning rearranging my living room furniture to create a more formal seating arrangement, removing personal touches that might invite emotional manipulation, and preparing materials with the methodical precision of someone who'd been planning this moment for longer than anyone realized. I offered beverages that everyone declined, the social niceties feeling hollow when the real business involved my financial future and Bethany's claimed desperation. My father carried a briefcase that probably contained updated loan applications and calculations designed to make their proposal seem more appealing, while my mother clutched a tissue box as though preparing for emotional breakdown. "Thank you all for coming," I said, settling into the chair I'd positioned to face the group directly. "I know this situation has been stressful for everyone, and I wanted to address it properly, with everyone hearing the same information at the same time." The formal tone surprised them, clearly different from the defensive or guilty responses they'd received during the week's pressure campaign. My father looked confused, scanning the papers with the expression of someone whose carefully prepared arguments had been preempted by information he hadn't considered. "These are just general guidelines," he said dismissively. "Every situation is unique." "Our situation is unique." "Actually, it's not," I replied, maintaining the calm tone I'd practiced with Dr. Richardson. "Families dealing with gambling addiction face this exact dilemma regularly, which is why there are established protocols for responding effectively." I pulled out another set of documents, these ones focused specifically on the cycle of enabling that kept addictive behaviors funded by family resources. Bethany shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly unprepared for a conversation that treated Her gambling is a medical condition rather than a series of unfortunate choices. I don't have a gambling addiction, she said quickly. I just made some bad decisions during a difficult time in my life. This isn't about addiction recovery or counseling. It's about getting out of a dangerous situation. The denial was immediate and predictable, but it also revealed something important about her understanding of the situation. She viewed her debt as an isolated crisis rather than the latest consequence of ongoing behavioral patterns, which meant she hadn't internalized the need for fundamental changes in her relationship with money and risk. The organizations I've contacted disagree with that assessment, I said gently, pulling out a printout of Bethany's credit report that I'd obtained through legal channels with Catherine's assistance. This shows a pattern of borrowing and default going back 7 years, including multiple payday loans, cash advances, and high-interest credit accounts that were opened and maxed out in rapid succession. The documentation was damning and comprehensive, revealing not just recent gambling debts but a long history of financial instability that contradicted her claims about isolated bad decisions. My parents looked shocked as they reviewed the credit report, apparently unaware of the extent of Bethany's financial chaos. "Where did you get this?" my mother asked, her voice sharp with accusation rather than concern about the information it contained. "You had no right to investigate your sister's private financial business." The attack was deflection, focusing on my methods rather than the disturbing pattern the report revealed. "I obtained it through legal channels as part of researching appropriate responses to family financial crises," I replied, my tone remaining professional. "Any family member considering co-signing loans or providing financial assistance has the right to understand the full scope of the financial situation they're being asked to address." Catherine had coached me on this exact moment, predicting that my family would attack the source of uncomfortable information rather than processing its implications. "People don't want to see patterns that require them to change their behavior," she'd explained. "They prefer to blame messengers rather than acknowledge difficult truths." My Uncle Tom, who'd remained silent through most of the meeting, finally spoke up. "Even if Bethany has made mistakes in the past, that doesn't mean we should abandon her when she's in danger now." His intervention was clearly coordinated, offering a reasonable-sounding middle ground that still led to the same conclusion: I should provide money regardless of the circumstances that had created the crisis. "I agree completely," I said, surprising everyone with my immediate concurrence. "Which is why I've compiled comprehensive resources for addressing gambling debt and addiction recovery, including 3 different organizations that specialize in negotiating with the exact type of creditors Bethany is dealing with." I distributed another set of documents, these ones containing contact information, service descriptions, and success rates for professional debt intervention services. The resources were legitimate and potentially effective, offering real solutions that didn't require family members to compromise their financial security. But the reception was lukewarm at best, with my parents scanning the information dismissively and Bethany looking increasingly agitated as she realized I was offering alternatives rather than money. "These services take time," my father objected. "Weeks or months to negotiate payment plans and settlements. Bethany doesn't have that kind of time." The objection revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of how debt resolution actually worked, assuming that immediate cash payment was the only viable solution to complex financial problems. The argument was designed to eliminate professional solutions by claiming her situation was uniquely dangerous, beyond the scope of organizations that dealt with similar cases daily. But I'd anticipated this objection and prepared accordingly. "I've also contacted the Portland Police Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit," I said quietly, watching everyone's faces as they processed this information. "Detective Marcus Williams specializes in cases involving predatory lending and loan sharking. He's available to meet with Bethany Monday morning to discuss protection options and legal remedies." The silence that followed was profound and telling. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody expressed relief that law enforcement might be able to address the safety concerns they'd been emphasizing all week. Instead, they looked uncomfortable, as though official involvement was somehow inappropriate for their family crisis. "We don't need police involvement," my mother said quickly, her voice tight with anxiety. "That would just complicate things unnecessarily." The objection was immediate and reflexive, revealing that despite their claims about Bethany's physical safety, they preferred to keep the situation within family bounds where emotional manipulation could be more effective than legal solutions. "Then we have a problem," I said, maintaining my calm tone despite the increasing tension in the room. "Because if Bethany is genuinely in physical danger from loan sharks, then police involvement is appropriate and necessary. If she's not actually in danger, then the urgency you've been describing is artificial, designed to pressure me into making financial decisions without proper consideration." The logical trap was simple but effective, forcing them to choose between Their claims about Bethany's safety and their preference for family-only solutions. They couldn't maintain both positions simultaneously without revealing inconsistencies in their narrative. My father tried to regain control of the conversation by returning to financial arguments. Even if these services could help, the process would take months. Bethany needs immediate relief from the pressure she's under. Your house equity is available now, today, through expedited loan processing. The letter outlined the risks of using secured debt to pay unsecured obligations, the potential impact on my credit if Bethany defaulted on repayment, and the legal complications that could arise if the money was used for purposes other than described in loan applications. But the most important section addressed what Catherine called financial boundary preservation. The legal language was intimidating and authoritative, designed to reframe the conversation from emotional family obligation to practical risk assessment. My parents looked uncomfortable with the official terminology, clearly unprepared for professional legal opinion that contradicted their assumptions about family financial responsibilities. I stood and walked to my home office, returning with a final folder that contained the most important documents I'd prepared. I've established a family financial assistance fund, I announced, opening the folder to reveal bank statements and legal documentation. It contains $5,000, available immediately for Bethany's use in accessing professional debt, counseling, addiction recovery services, or legal assistance. The offer was substantial but strategic, providing real help while maintaining boundaries about what kind of assistance I was willing to provide. $5,000 could fund months of professional support services, but it couldn't be used to pay creditors directly or enable continued gambling behavior. The fund comes with requirements, I continued, reading from a formal agreement Catherine had helped me draft. Completion of a certified financial counseling program, participation in gambling addiction recovery services, and monthly financial check-ins with approved counselors. The money is available immediately, but only for services that address underlying problems rather than just immediate consequences. Bethany's face went through a series of expressions, from hope to disappointment to something approaching anger. $5,000 won't even make a dent in what I owe, she said, her voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard before. You're offering pocket change when you have access to 10 times that amount through your house. The response revealed what I'd suspected throughout the week's pressure campaign. This wasn't really about getting help for gambling addiction or escaping dangerous creditors. It was about accessing the largest possible amount of money with the fewest strings attached, using my family's love and concern as leverage to obtain funds that could be used however she chose. My parents looked bewildered, clearly struggling to process information that had demolished their assumptions about how this meeting would proceed. They'd prepared for resistance, guilt, negotiations about loan terms and repayment schedules. They hadn't prepared for professional documentation, legal analysis, or alternative solutions that shifted focus from family financial intervention to individual accountability and recovery services. The reframing was deliberate and strategic, moving the conversation away from family obligation and toward medical necessity. If Bethany had diabetes, nobody would expect family members to provide insulin indefinitely rather than helping her learn to manage her condition independently. Gambling addiction deserved the same approach, professional treatment rather than family funding, but Bethany's response revealed how little she wanted to engage with solutions that required personal change rather than external rescue. I don't need addiction counseling, she said firmly. I need money to pay off dangerous people who are threatening my safety. Everything else is a distraction from the immediate problem. The statement was clarifying in its honesty, admitting that she viewed professional help as irrelevant to her crisis and family money as the only acceptable solution. She wasn't interested in addressing gambling addiction because she didn't believe she had gambling addiction, despite credit reports and spending patterns that clearly indicated otherwise. The standoff was clear and irreversible, two completely different philosophies about family assistance and personal responsibility. My family wanted me to provide money that would make the immediate problem disappear without requiring Bethany to change anything about her behavior or relationship with money. I was offering support for genuine change that would make similar crises less likely in the future. My father tried one last negotiation, pulling documents from his briefcase with the determination of someone who'd invested too much effort to accept defeat easily. What if we compromise? You take out $25,000 instead of the full amount. That gives Bethany enough to negotiate with these creditors while reducing your financial exposure. The proposal was designed to sound reasonable, splitting the difference between their request and my refusal. But it missed the fundamental point that any amount of money given without addressing underlying problems would simply delay the next crisis while compromising my financial security unnecessarily. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice memo. I'd recorded during my consultation with Dr. Sandra Chen, a gambling addiction specialist who'd agreed to speak with me about family intervention strategies. Her voice filled the room with professional authority as she explained why family financial bailouts typically worsened gambling addiction rather than resolving it. The recording continued with statistics about recidivism rates among gambling addicts who received family financial assistance versus those who worked through professional debt resolution services. The numbers were stark. Family-funded debt relief led to repeated crises in over 80% of cases, while professional intervention achieved lasting behavior change in 60% of participants. The legal complexity was intentional and effective, creating bureaucratic obstacles to the simple transaction my family had envisioned. They'd assumed that pressuring me emotionally would lead directly to financial compliance, but the corporate structure required different types of decisions based on objective business criteria rather than family feelings. My father looked stunned, clearly realizing that his research into equity loans had been based on incorrect assumptions about property ownership and decision-making authority. "You put your house in a corporation to avoid helping your family?" he asked, his voice heavy with disbelief and disappointment. The comparison was deliberate, treating family financial decisions like business decisions that required objective analysis rather than emotional response. But it also revealed something my family found disturbing. I'd been planning for this type of crisis long before it occurred, preparing defenses against their future requests rather than assuming family love would prevent financial manipulation. Patricia had been growing increasingly agitated throughout my presentation, and she finally exploded with the frustration of someone whose emotional arguments had been systematically dismantled by facts and documentation. "This is sick," she said, standing abruptly from my couch. "You've turned family relationships into some kind of legal battle where you hide behind lawyers and corporations instead of just helping people you're supposed to love." The accusation was designed to make my preparation seem pathological rather than prudent, but it also revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of what protection meant. They viewed boundaries as barriers to love rather than structures that preserved relationships by preventing exploitation and resentment. But my grandmother surprised everyone by speaking with more clarity than she'd shown all afternoon. "Because it's not the help we want," she said simply. "We want you to solve this problem the way families should solve problems, with money and love and sacrifice for each other." Her honesty was refreshing and disturbing, admitting that they weren't interested in effective solutions if those solutions didn't match their expectations about family financial dynamics. The admission hung in the air like a confession, revealing that their campaign to pressure me into liquidating my house equity wasn't based on what would actually help Bethany most effectively. It was based on their beliefs about how family relationships should work, regardless of professional recommendations or objective analysis of the situation. Bethany made one final attempt to salvage their preferred outcome, her voice shifting back to the vulnerable desperation she'd used throughout the week. "Maureen, please. I know you have good intentions with all this research and professional help. But I'm scared. Really scared. And I need my family to protect me the way families are supposed to protect each other." The appeal was expertly crafted, positioning my refusal to provide money as abandonment of family protective instincts. But it also revealed that she viewed family protection as synonymous with financial rescue, rather than support for developing the skills and resources needed to protect herself. "I am protecting you," I said quietly. "I'm protecting you from a cycle that will eventually destroy your financial future completely. I'm protecting our family from the resentment and financial damage that comes from repeatedly funding poor choices. And I'm protecting myself from enabling behavior that hurts everyone involved, including you." The campaign to pressure me into liquidating my assets had failed, but I knew this wasn't the end of their efforts. Tomorrow would bring new tactics, different approaches, escalating consequences for my refusal to fund solutions that professional experts specifically advised against. They'd learned that preparation and documentation could neutralize guilt and manipulation, but they hadn't accepted that my answer was final. I spent the evening updating my files with notes from the meeting, documenting each person's arguments and responses for future reference. The patterns were becoming clearer with each interaction, showing how thoroughly my family had misunderstood both my character and my preparation for exactly this type of crisis. The house around me felt different than it had a week earlier, not just as shelter but as symbol of what careful choices could create and protect. Tomorrow would test whether that protection was strong enough to withstand the full force of family disapproval, but tonight, I was confident in the foundation I'd built and the principles that supported it. My mother looked frustrated with my request for details. "Does it matter what he said exactly? The point is that Bethany is going to be homeless on top of everything else. Are you really going to let your sister live on the streets because you're too stubborn to help her?" The emotional manipulation was crude but effective, designed to make me feel responsible for consequences that were actually the result of Bethany's choices and my family's previous enabling, but I'd prepared for this type of escalation as well. If Bethany is being evicted because of creditor harassment, that's illegal under Oregon tenant protection laws, I said, opening my phone to show her the legal aid number I'd programmed specifically for this scenario. Detective Williams can address creditor intimidation, and there are emergency housing services that specialize in protecting people from financial harassment. My mother's expression darkened as she realized I had answers for every crisis they presented, solutions that didn't require my financial sacrifice but did require acknowledging that Bethany's situation had legal and professional remedies they preferred to ignore. You have an answer for everything, don't you? She said bitterly. Lawyers and counselors and services for every problem except the simple one that would actually help your sister immediately. She gathered her purse with jerky, angry movements. I hope you can live with yourself when something terrible happens to her. Wednesday brought news that confirmed my suspicions about the escalating drama. Derek called with information he'd gathered from family conversations he'd been monitoring with increasing concern. The eviction story isn't true, he said without preamble. I drove by Bethany's apartment complex yesterday evening. She was bringing groceries inside, no signs of moving boxes or eviction notices. Thursday afternoon brought the most sophisticated pressure yet. I returned home from client meetings to find a man in a dark suit waiting by my front door, briefcase in hand and business card ready. He introduced himself as Robert Chen, financial advisor from Premier Wealth Management, explaining that my family had retained his services to help facilitate family financial planning discussions. Your relatives are concerned that emotional factors might be preventing optimal financial decision-making, Robert said, his tone professionally neutral but clearly advocating for my family's position. Sometimes objective third-party analysis can help families see past individual concerns to focus on collective welfare. The approach was clever, using professional credibility to legitimize their pressure campaign while maintaining the appearance of seeking objective advice rather than overriding my judgment. But I'd encountered similar tactics in my own professional practice, where family members hired competing accountants to provide opinions that supported their preferred financial decisions. What specific analysis did you provide to my family? I asked, curious about what information they'd shared with their hired advocate. Robert's smile was practiced and evasive. I reviewed general family financial planning strategies for addressing emergency situations involving multiple generations and asset types. The vague language told me everything I needed to know. Robert hadn't been given access to my actual financial information, hadn't reviewed the professional recommendations I'd obtained, and hadn't been briefed on the alternative solutions I'd provided. He was working from incomplete information designed to support predetermined conclusions. I declined his services politely but firmly, explaining that I already had professional financial guidance from advisors who understood the complete situation, including the addiction recovery aspects that were being ignored. Robert's disappointment was obvious, revealing that he'd been promised a consulting fee contingent on convincing me to change my position. Friday evening brought confirmation of Catherine's analysis. My father called with a tone I'd never heard before, flat and defeated rather than urgent or manipulative. We've been trying to find other solutions, he said without preamble. Looking into loans we might qualify for, researching whether any other family members could help, exploring every option that doesn't involve your house. The admission was both satisfying and sad, revealing that they'd finally begun considering alternatives they should have explored before pressuring me to liquidate my assets. We can't find anything that works, he continued. Banks won't lend to us anymore, extended family doesn't have that kind of money available, and the timeline is too short for most of the professional services you recommended. There was something different in his voice, a recognition that their preferred solution had always been the easiest rather than the best, requiring my sacrifice rather than their effort or creativity. Bethany is going to have to face whatever consequences come from this situation, he said heavily. And we're going to have to live with the fact that we couldn't protect her. What about the resources I provided? I asked, genuinely curious whether they'd pursued any of the professional alternatives I'd researched. My father's pause was long enough to be telling. Bethany wasn't interested in counseling or addiction programs. She said they wouldn't solve her immediate problem with these creditors. The response confirmed what I'd suspected throughout the crisis. Bethany had never been interested in solutions that required personal change or accountability. She'd wanted family financial intervention specifically because it allowed her to escape consequences without addressing the behaviors that had created them. And the debt negotiation services? I pressed. The organizations that specialize in resolving exactly this type of creditor situation? My father's sigh was heavy with frustration and exhaustion. They wanted too much documentation, too many details about her financial history. Bethany said it felt invasive and humiliating. The explanation was revealing. Professional services required transparency and accountability that Bethany found uncomfortable, while family financial assistance allowed her to maintain privacy about her gambling habits and spending patterns. She preferred solutions that didn't require her to examine or change her relationship with money. Saturday brought an unexpected call from Detective Williams, the financial crime specialist I'd contacted earlier in the week. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation about your sister's situation," he said, his voice professionally neutral. "I haven't heard from her directly, but I've been looking into the creditors she described. I think you should know what I've found." The information Detective Williams shared was both illuminating and disturbing. The loan sharks Bethany claimed to be terrified of were actually a legitimate debt collection agency operating within legal boundaries, using aggressive but lawful tactics to pursue payment from delinquent borrowers. "They're not pleasant to deal with," Detective Williams explained, "but they're not the dangerous criminals your family has been describing." More significantly, his investigation had revealed that Bethany's debt was primarily to licensed online gambling platforms rather than illegal loan sharks, and that she'd been actively gambling throughout the week when she claimed to be too terrified to leave her apartment. "She's used 3 different online casinos in the past 5 days, Detective Williams said. "Someone genuinely afraid of creditor retaliation typically stops engaging in the behavior that created the debt." The evidence was damning and comprehensive, revealing that Bethany's crisis was ongoing rather than historical, active rather than resolved. She hadn't just made poor choices in the past. She was continuing to make them while simultaneously claiming to be desperate for family financial rescue. "I'm required to inform you that using family assets to pay gambling debts while the gambling continues is considered enabling behavior that can prolong addiction rather than resolving it," Detective Williams continued. "If your family is serious about helping her, they should focus on addiction intervention services rather than debt payment." The professional confirmation of everything I'd researched was both validating and sobering. Law enforcement, debt counseling organizations, addiction specialists, and financial planners were unanimous in their recommendations against family financial intervention for active gambling addiction. My family's pressure campaign was asking me to act contrary to expert advice from every relevant professional field. Sunday afternoon brought what appeared to be their final attempt at persuasion. All 6 family members who'd attended Saturday's meeting returned to my house, but their approach was entirely different. Instead of pressure and manipulation, they came with surrender and what appeared to be genuine desperation. "We've tried everything," my mother said, settling onto my couch with the defeated posture of someone who'd exhausted all options. "Loans, family contacts, mediation services, financial advisors. Nothing works. We can't come up with the money Bethany needs." Her admission was both honest and strategic, designed to make me feel responsible for solving a crisis they'd finally acknowledged they couldn't handle independently. My father produced a stack of rejection letters from banks and credit unions, documentation of their failed attempts to qualify for loans that would have avoided involving my assets. "We've been turned down everywhere," he said, spreading the papers across my coffee table like evidence in a trial. "Bad credit, insufficient income, too much existing debt. Nobody will lend to us anymore." The documentation was sobering, revealing the extent of their financial deterioration through years of bailing Bethany out of previous crises. They'd borrowed against their own home equity multiple times, maxed out credit cards for family emergencies, and compromised their creditworthiness to the point where legitimate lenders viewed them as unacceptable risks. "We understand now why you wanted us to explore other options first," Patricia said, her tone more humble than it had been during any previous conversation. "We should have listened to your research about professional services and legal alternatives before assuming you'd solve this through your house equity." The acknowledgement was gratifying but suspect, arriving only after they'd confirmed that other funding sources were unavailable. They weren't accepting my position because they'd come to understand its wisdom, but because they'd exhausted alternatives and were returning to their original pressure tactics with renewed desperation. Bethany's approach was different this time, stripped of the performance elements that had characterized her previous appeals. "I know you think I'm manipulating everyone," she said quietly, her voice carrying genuine exhaustion rather than manufactured emotion. "And maybe I have been, without meaning to. But the debt is real, and the collection calls are real, and I'm scared about what happens next." The honesty was refreshing after a week of theatrical desperation, but it also revealed something important about her understanding of the situation. She was beginning to acknowledge her own manipulation while still expecting it to be effective, recognizing her behavior patterns while hoping family love would override rational response to those patterns. I've made a lot of mistakes, Bethany continued, looking directly at me for the first time during any of our conversations. With money, with gambling, with expecting other people to fix problems I created. But I don't know how to get out of this hole without help, and you're the only person who can provide the kind of help I need. The vulnerability seemed genuine, but it was still framed around my obligation to provide financial assistance rather than her need to accept professional help for gambling addiction. She was acknowledging mistakes while maintaining that family money was the appropriate solution for problems created by those mistakes. What if I took the $5,000 you offered and used it exactly the way you specified? She asked, her voice taking on a negotiating tone. Financial counseling, addiction services, whatever programs you think would help. But could you also provide some additional money for immediate debt relief? Even $10,000 would give me breathing room to participate in these programs without credit or pressure. The counteroffer was sophisticated, accepting my conditions while still seeking access to my home equity through a different justification. But it revealed that she still didn't understand the fundamental principle I was trying to establish. That addressing gambling addiction required complete separation from family financial enabling, not compromise solutions that provided both professional help and continued family funding. The $5,000 is available immediately, I said, reaching for the folder containing fund documentation. But only for professional services, and only if you agree to complete transparency about your financial situation with certified counselors who can verify that gambling activity has stopped completely. The requirements were non-negotiable, designed to ensure that any money I provided supported recovery rather than continued gambling. Bethany's face went through a series of expressions as she processed the implications of complete financial transparency with addiction counselors. That seems really invasive, she said finally. Like I'm being treated as a criminal rather than someone who needs help. The objection revealed her fundamental resistance to accountability, preferring family assistance that came without oversight or requirements for behavior change. My grandmother, who'd been silent throughout most of the conversation, finally spoke with a clarity that surprised everyone. Maybe that's exactly what she needs, she said quietly, looking directly at Bethany. Maybe we've been helping in ways that weren't actually helpful. The observation was profound and unexpected, coming from someone who'd been participating in the pressure campaign earlier in the week. I've been thinking about what Maureen said during our last meeting, my grandmother continued, her voice gaining strength. About enabling and consequences and professional help. I raised 5 children, and I made mistakes with all of them about when to help and when to step back. Maybe we're making the same mistakes with Bethany. The shift in perspective was startling, particularly coming from the family member whose opinion carried the most emotional weight. But it also triggered immediate resistance from my parents, who'd invested too much effort in their pressure campaign to accept that it might be fundamentally misguided. Mom, you don't understand how serious this situation has become, my father said urgently, clearly trying to prevent further erosion of family support for their position. These aren't normal debts that can be handled through counseling and payment plans. These are dangerous people who use violence to collect money. But my grandmother's expression had hardened into something I recognized from childhood, the look she wore when she'd made a decision that wouldn't be changed by argument or persuasion. If they're that dangerous, then Bethany needs police protection, not family money. And if they're not that dangerous, then we've been lying to ourselves about why immediate cash payment is the only solution. The logic was simple and devastating. To my parents' arguments, cutting through weeks of emotional manipulation to focus on the fundamental contradictions in their narrative. Either Bethany was in genuine physical danger that required law enforcement intervention, or she was facing normal debt collection pressure that could be addressed through professional services. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of my grandmother's observation. My parents looked stricken, realizing that their most effective emotional ally had switched sides based on rational analysis of the situation. Bethany appeared genuinely shocked that anyone in the family was questioning the narrative she'd been constructing around her crisis. I think, my grandmother said slowly, that Maureen has been the only one thinking clearly about this situation. We've been so focused on immediate relief that we haven't considered whether that relief would actually help Bethany in the long run. She turned to look at my parents directly. How many times have we had this exact conversation? How many emergencies have we solved with family money that didn't solve anything at all? The questions were rhetorical but powerful, forcing everyone to acknowledge the pattern they'd been perpetuating without conscious recognition. My grandmother's support shifted the entire dynamic of the conversation, transforming my resistance from stubborn selfishness to prudent boundary setting based on family history and professional advice. As the meeting concluded, my parents looked exhausted and defeated, their week-long campaign finally collapsing under the weight of documented evidence, professional recommendations, and family dissent. They'd assumed that coordinated pressure would eventually overcome my resistance, but they'd underestimated both my preparation and the eventual recognition by other family members that their tactics were counterproductive. Bethany left without taking the resource materials I'd prepared, her disappointment obvious in her reluctance to accept help that came with accountability requirements. But Patricia surprised me by lingering after everyone else had gone, studying the professional service documentation with what appeared to be genuine interest. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "Raymond and I got caught up in the emergency atmosphere without really thinking about whether immediate family financial intervention was the best long-term solution." She picked up one of the debt counseling brochures, reading through the service descriptions with attention she hadn't shown during previous conversations. As Sunday evening approached, I sat in my quiet house reviewing the week's events and their implications for future family relationships. The pressure campaign had failed, but it had also revealed fundamental differences in how we understood love, help, boundaries, and accountability. Those differences wouldn't disappear just because their immediate crisis hadn't been resolved through my financial sacrifice. The phone rang one final time as I was preparing for bed. Bethany's voice was different now, stripped of both desperation and performance, carrying simple exhaustion. "I'm going to try those counseling services you researched," she said without preamble. "Not because I think I need them, but because I don't have any other options left." After we hung up, I realized that the crisis was finally shifting from family financial emergency to individual accountability for gambling addiction and its consequences. It had taken a week of pressure, documentation, professional consultation, and family conflict, but the situation was finally being addressed through appropriate channels rather than enabling financial intervention. 3 weeks later, I received the phone call I'd been waiting for without realizing it. Bethany's voice was different, clearer somehow, stripped of the urgency and manipulation that had characterized our conversations during the crisis. "I wanted to update you on the counseling program," she said, her tone matter-of-fact rather than emotional. "It's working. Not the way I expected, but it's working." She'd enrolled in the intensive financial counseling program at Recovery Northwest, using the $5,000 from my assistance fund to cover 3 months of sessions, addiction support groups, and legal aid for debt negotiation. "They helped me understand that the $47,000 wasn't actually what I owed," Bethany continued. "A lot of it was inflated interest and fees that weren't legally enforceable. The real debt was about $28,000. The revelation was significant but not surprising. Professional debt counselors were trained to identify predatory lending practices and inflated claims that intimidated borrowers into paying more than they legally owed. Family members responding to emotional crisis rarely had the expertise to distinguish between legitimate debt and collection agency manipulation. The counselors also helped me realize that I'd been gambling to try to win money to pay gambling debts," Bethany said with a rueful laugh. "Which sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but it felt logical when I was in the middle of it. The panic made it impossible to think clearly about what I was actually doing." Her insight was encouraging, suggesting that professional intervention was addressing psychological aspects of gambling addiction that family financial rescue would never have touched. The crisis had forced her into therapy and counseling that revealed patterns she'd been unable or unwilling to see independently. "They negotiated a payment plan with the collection agency," Bethany continued. $200 a month for 3 years, with legal protection against harassment or additional fees. "It's manageable with my restaurant income, especially now that I'm not spending money at casinos." The practical solution was exactly what the debt counseling organizations had promised when I'd researched their services weeks earlier. Professional negotiation had achieved a sustainable resolution that protected Bethany from creditor pressure while requiring her to take responsibility for repayment through her own income rather than family financial intervention, but the most significant change was in how she talked about the experience. "I was angry at you for weeks," she admitted, "for refusing to just solve the problem with your house money. But the counselors helped me understand that solving it that way wouldn't have actually solved anything. I would have learned that family resources were available whenever my choices created problems." The recognition was profound and represented genuine progress in understanding the enabling patterns that had characterized our family financial dynamics for years. Bethany was beginning to see that my refusal to provide money had forced her into professional help that was more effective than family financial intervention would have been. "The hardest part was admitting that I have a gambling addiction," she continued. "Not just bad luck or poor choices, but an actual addiction that requires ongoing management like any other medical condition. The family pressure to get money quickly was actually making it harder to face that reality." The insight was exactly what Dr. Richardson had predicted during our final therapy session. Family financial crisis often prevented addicts from seeking appropriate professional help because emergency funding seemed like a simpler solution that didn't require acknowledging the underlying condition or committing to behavior change. Point 2. Months after the crisis, I received an unexpected call from Lisa Martinez, the financial planner who'd helped me structure my asset protection strategies. I've been getting referrals from Catherine Singh about other clients who need help establishing family financial boundaries, she said. Apparently word has spread about your successful handling of a difficult family financial situation. The information was flattering but also intriguing. My experience with my family's pressure campaign had apparently impressed the professional network I'd assembled, leading to opportunities one hadn't anticipated when I'd first sought their advice about protecting my assets from family financial demands. Would you be interested in consulting on family financial boundary cases? Lisa asked. There's growing demand for people who understand both the technical aspects of asset protection and the emotional dynamics of family financial manipulation. Your combination of accounting expertise and personal experience could be valuable for other clients facing similar situations. The opportunity was unexpected and appealing, offering a way to monetize the painful experience I'd navigated while helping others who were struggling with comparable family financial pressure. Over the following weeks, I began consulting with Lisa's clients who needed guidance on establishing boundaries with relatives who expected unlimited access to their resources during emergencies. The consulting work was both financially rewarding and emotionally satisfying, providing income that more than compensated for any family relationship strain caused by my refusal to liquidate my home equity. But more importantly, it connected me with other people who'd learned to balance family love with financial self-preservation, creating a professional network that understood the complexity of maintaining boundaries with people you cared about. My relationship with my parents slowly improved as they adjusted to the reality that I wouldn't be solving future family financial crises through personal sacrifice. The initial hurt and disappointment gradually gave way to what appeared to be grudging respect for my ability to maintain difficult decisions under enormous pressure. The grudging acceptance was progress, though it still framed my position as lucky rather than well-researched and strategically sound. But I no longer needed their validation of my decision-making process. The results spoke for themselves. Bethany was addressing her gambling addiction through professional help, the debt crisis was being resolved through sustainable monthly payments, and my financial security remained intact. The transformation was gradual but genuine, building on small successes and professional guidance rather than dramatic family financial intervention. Bethany was learning to solve problems through personal effort and expert assistance, developing skills that would serve her throughout her life rather than depending on family resources whenever challenges arose. I wanted to thank you, she said toward the end of our conversation, for refusing to enable me when everyone else was ready to. It didn't feel like help at the time, but it was the only kind of help that could actually work. The gratitude was unexpected and moving, representing a level of self-awareness she'd never demonstrated during the original crisis. My consulting practice continued expanding, with referrals from Catherine, Lisa, Dr. Richardson, and satisfied clients who'd successfully navigated family financial boundary challenges. The work was emotionally demanding but intellectually satisfying, requiring me to help people balance love and logic, family loyalty and financial self-preservation. One particular case reminded me of my own situation 6 months earlier. A successful nurse whose parents expected her to fund her brother's repeated business failures, each new venture requiring larger family investment while producing smaller returns. They say I'm selfish for wanting to buy a house instead of supporting his entrepreneurial dreams, she told me during our initial consultation. Working with clients like her reinforced my understanding that the principles I'd developed weren't unique to gambling addiction or sibling dynamics. They applied to any situation where family love was being used to override financial boundaries, where emotional manipulation was substituted for rational problem solving, where one person's discipline was expected to compensate for another person's lack of it. Dr. Richardson had been particularly encouraging about the professional direction my experience had taken. You've transformed a painful family crisis into expertise that helps other people, she said during one of our final sessions. That's the kind of resilience that turns trauma into growth. The validation was meaningful, coming from someone who'd watched me navigate the emotional challenges of maintaining boundaries under family pressure. Catherine had also expressed interest in referring clients who needed both legal asset protection and practical guidance about family financial dynamics. Most estate planning attorneys understand the technical aspects, she'd explained, but few have personal experience with the emotional challenges families create when they try to access protected assets. My house on Maple Street remained mine. its equity intact and its significance enhanced by the knowledge that I'd successfully protected it from well-meaning family members who would have liquidated my security to fund continued enabling of destructive behavior. The rooms I'd carefully furnished and maintained represented not just shelter but victory, evidence that preparation and principle could overcome manipulation and pressure. The silence I'd chosen during that original family meeting, when everyone expected me to surrender my position under collective pressure, had created space for professional solutions that served everyone's long-term interests more effectively than the family financial intervention they demanded. 6 months later, I received an invitation that felt like completion. Bethany was hosting a dinner party to celebrate 1 year of gambling sobriety and debt-free living, achieved through professional counseling and her own persistent effort rather than family financial rescue. "I wanted you to see what real help made possible," she wrote in the invitation. "And to thank you for being strong enough to say no when I needed someone to say no." The dinner party was small and understated, held in the apartment she'd managed to keep through debt negotiation and payment planning. The space was modest but clean, decorated with care rather than expense, reflecting someone who'd learned to find satisfaction in what she could afford rather than constantly reaching for what she couldn't. As I looked around the table at family members who'd learned to celebrate Bethany's genuine achievements rather than just rescuing her from consequences, I realized that maintaining my boundaries had created space for everyone to grow into healthier relationships with money, responsibility, and each other. The woman who'd once demanded I liquidate my home equity was now teaching financial literacy to other gambling addiction recovery participants, using her experience with debt negotiation and professional counseling to help people who were facing similar crises. The transformation was profound and sustainable, built on skills and self-awareness rather than external rescue and continued enabling. My house remained on Maple Street, its equity protected and its significance enhanced by the knowledge that I'd chosen principle over pressure when the choice mattered most. But more than a financial victory, it represented evidence that love sometimes required saying no, that help sometimes meant refusing to provide money, and that family loyalty sometimes demanded protecting people from their own destructive patterns rather than funding their continuation. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.